All right, welcome back. We're going to be talking about section 7.2 and section 7.3 here today. And what we're dealing with is, again, the cell membrane and how it is managing all the substances that it has to exchange from the outside world to the inside world and vice versa. The plasma membrane cannot allow anything to just come across as it feels, but it does have a need to get certain molecules in. Therefore, we say that the membrane is selectively permeable, thus regulating the cell's molecular traffic. Again, there are going to be some materials that are going to move through the cell membrane easily. If you're a nonpolar molecule, you can get through that hydrophobic layer. If you are a polar molecule, you're going to have a hard time without some gates and some doors and other structures to help facilitate moving that material in through the cell membrane. So that's what it's talking about here. We have these hydrophobic nonpolar molecules like hydrocarbons. They can get dissolved through sugars, which are polar, and water and some other molecules are going to have a much more difficult time getting through the membrane, and so therefore they're going to need some doors, some gates, or some channels. These transport proteins are going to allow the passage of certain hydrophilic substances, and oftentimes if water, well, a specific one that involves the passage of water is what we call an aquaporin. And there are others that obviously do not involve water. There are going to be certain molecules or ions that are going to need to pass through, and they're going to need a specific protein channel to do that. It could be based on the shape of the protein. It could be based on whether it has a carrier molecule attached to it, or it could be just based on the cell using energy to distort that opening in order to get that molecule inside. And that's called active transport, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the chapter. Other transport proteins, I've already talked about this, I'm getting ahead of myself here. They're going to bind and change the shape of that opening so that they can get them through the membrane. And each transport protein is going to be specific for the substance that it is moving across the plasma membrane. So we'll get into some examples of that here later on, but today's primary conversation is dealing with passive transport. What does that mean? That means that the cell has invested no energy in moving this material back and forth across the membrane, and primarily it's going to deal with the process of diffusion. And I think you know what diffusion is already. It's the tendency of molecules to spread out evenly, and so in other words, if you have a high concentration of molecules on one side of the membrane and a very low concentration on the other, the molecules are going to want to move in this direction in order to spread out evenly. Okay, so the example that's used in all science classes would be, what if I had a perfume bottle and I opened it up in the front of the room? The people sitting in the front of the room would be able to smell that perfume rather quickly upon opening of that bottle. Why? Well, because the molecules inside the bottle are really tightly packed together. The concentration is very high, and so they're going to be moving and trying to spread out as much as they can. The people in the back of the room are not going to be able to smell the perfume until much later, when the molecules have had a chance to continue to migrate outward from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. We have to keep it in mind, though, in the cell, we're talking about a dynamic equilibrium. We're talking about the movement of molecules across the membrane, and it's not going to be just moving in one direction. As molecules are moving to this side of the membrane, there are some molecules moving in this side. There's going to be more going in this direction than there are going in this direction, so eventually it's going to balance out, but it's a dynamic equilibrium. We have molecules moving, and they don't stop moving just because they've gotten everything balanced out. They're going to keep moving back and forth. All right.
The plasma
Taking a look
membrane
at
is
this
selectively permeable.
animation
It
for
lets some
membranes.
substances through and not others. The hydrophobic interior of the bilayer is one reason membranes are selectively permeable. Hydrophobic molecules, those that are soluble in lipids, can easily pass through the membrane. In addition, small molecules like O2 can sneak between the phospholipids of the membrane. On the other hand, large hydrophilic molecules like glucose and ions such as sodium ions and hydrogen ions cannot pass through the membrane unaided.
Diffusion across a biological membrane is called passive transport, since the cell expends no energy to move the molecules. Oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules move into and out of cells by passive transport.
And this is going to be a really important part of the life processes of a unicellular organism or a multicellular organism, simply because you can't afford to be expending energy to move oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. That's going on all the time. The cell would run out of energy for such a process. So in order to ease the burden of the cell and its issues with passive transport, well, its issues with just movement of materials in and out of the cell, the cell membrane has to be designed so that these molecules, as small as they are able to just pass without any involvement of the cell. And again, it's all based on diffusion. If you have, constantly the intake of oxygen into our lungs, it's diffusing into our bloodstream, and therefore, as it moves around the cells, it can diffuse into the cells. As the cell is using food for energy, breaking it down, one of the byproducts of that reaction is carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide level inside the cell is building up. It's going to diffuse out into the bloodstream. As your bloodstream passes through the lungs, it diffuses out into the lungs and you exhale it, depending on your level of activity. So that's a very important life process. If we were to, put a little bit of food coloring into water and have a membrane that would allow certain molecules to pass and other molecules not to pass, then you would start to see net diffusion. Alright, so let's just pretend that this color on one side of the membrane is red. Over time, you're going to see more and more red color start to appear on the other side of that membrane. It's got pores in it, and it's important to keep and remember, though, this is dynamic equilibrium. We have, at some point, we've reached a stage where the rate of molecules entering this side of the membrane is going to be equal to the rate of the molecules going to the other side of the membrane. It's going to balance out eventually. Everything equalizes on both sides of the membrane, if possible. The same thing is true with solutes. We're talking sugar molecules, protein molecules, all these different molecules that have to pass through this concentration gradient, which is the plasma membrane. And if it's passive, then no work is being done by the cell. The diffusion of substances across a biological membrane is what we call passive transport, because no energy is being expended. We've said that already. The real bugger in this whole process is water. Because water is such a small molecule, it's kind of difficult to control its movement. And water is going to diffuse across a membrane in order to balance out concentrations. Okay, so now we're not just talking about food coloring molecules moving across the membrane. We're talking about water moving to one side or the other to balance out solute concentrations. So water is going to move from an area of low solute concentration to a region of high solute concentration in an effort to equalize the concentration on both sides of the membrane. This is good, but it can be bad in certain situations, simply based on the fact that water's moving and it's difficult to control. So we'll give you some examples as we're going here. Here's an interesting experiment that will show this. We have a U-tube with a membrane in the middle of this tube, and on one side of the membrane we have filled the tube with a liquid that is a very low concentration of sugar in it. So in other words, there's some solute molecules in there, but not very many. On the other side of the tube, the concentration of sugar, solute molecules, is much higher. If we leave this for any period of time, the water is going to start moving in this direction from low concentration to high concentration in an effort to balance it out so that the concentration of moles per liter, or grams per liter or whatever, is going to be equal. So you're going to see the water start to rise on this side of the tube in an effort to balance out those concentrations. Sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes there's not enough water to move, the concentration difference is too great, and that's going to be a real problem for the cell. But if you're looking at this at the atomic level, we have water molecules associated with these sugar molecules. Because they're polar, they're going to be kind of sticking together, and so there's not as many free water molecules on this side of the membrane that are available to go to this side. And again, remember, everything is moving back and forth. It's not like no water molecules are going in this direction. We're talking about a net change. There are still water molecules moving to this side, but because there are far fewer sugar molecules tying up the water molecules on this side, that means there's a lot more available to transfer to the side of the U-tube that's gaining water. So there's a net change that's moving in one direction. It's not going to equalize until that concentration is equalized. Alright, so this is going to bring us to some really important terms that you need to know for the lab that we're doing this week. Isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. These terms are specific to the movement of water in cells. And tonicity is the ability of a surrounding solution to cause a cell to gain or lose water. Where does this come into play? Well, again, if we're talking about IV solutions, you go to a hospital, you need an IV solution because you're dehydrated or whatever. The person that is providing this IV bag needs to make sure that that IV bag is isotonic. In other words, the solute concentration inside the bag is equal to the solute concentration in your body. If it's not, if that bag is hypertonic, in other words, the solute concentration is greater, then you're going to find that the water in your cells are going to start leaving your cells in an effort to balance out that concentration. Your cells are going to shrivel up, they're going to shrink, and that's going to be a real problem for the organism. The opposite case would be if the IV bag was hypotonic. In other words, there's a lot more water and the concentration is much less than what it is inside your cells. Now the water is moving into your cells. The cells are going to gain water, they're going to swell up, and in the case of animal cells, they're eventually going to burst. That plasma membrane is not strong enough to handle a situation like this. If you're a plant cell, that's probably actually a good thing, because of the cell wall, there's going to reach a point where it's going to become turgid, it's going to be stretched to its maximum capacity, and the water is not going to be able to fit into the cell anymore because this cell wall is not expanding any further. And so it's a little bit different when you're talking plant cells compared to animal cells. And this is a good visual example showing what's going on here in hypotonic solutions. Again, this is where water is moving into the cell. In case of the example that we're giving, the IV bag, your red blood cells are going to start exploding because of the fact that they can't pump the water out fast enough. Isotonic would be we have water moving in, we have water moving out, and the rates are basically the same so that it doesn't damage the cell. Here, water is rapidly moving out because of the concentration of solute particles is much higher on the outside than it is on the inside.